The war between two worlds almost ended because of a single sentence. That was the line Sergeant Ethan Walker heard echo through the massive chamber as he stood at attention in a dress uniform that still felt too tight across his shoulders. The hall of the United Earth Assembly looked different today. The lights were dimmer. The air colder. Rows of diplomats filled the curved seats rising like stadium bleachers, their quiet whispers bouncing off walls of polished steel and glass. Above them, beyond the massive transparent dome, the stars burned cold and distant. But one light out there wasn't a star. It was a ship. A ship so large it looked like a floating city hanging over Earth. The Aurelian flagship. Nearly 2 miles long. Silver hull glowing faintly in the sunlight. Ethan had seen it earlier from the transport shuttle window, and for a moment he'd forgotten to breathe. The war had ended the moment that ship arrived. No more patrol alarms. No more emergency briefings. Just silence. Now Ethan stood on the floor of the assembly hall with 3 other soldiers while politicians debated the future of 2 civilizations. His boots felt heavy against the polished marble. He had no idea why he was here. Sergeant Ethan Walker was a logistics infantryman from Colorado. 29 years old. 6 feet tall. 190 pounds. Not a hero. Not a famous pilot. Not a decorated commander. Just a soldier who followed orders and tried to get everyone home alive. So when the invitation came from command saying he had been selected for a diplomatic ceremony with the Aurelian Empire, he assumed someone upstairs had mixed up paperwork. Maybe they wanted a symbolic soldier in the room. Maybe someone with a clean record. Ethan had plenty of those. Clean missions. Clean discipline reports. Clean reputation for helping rookies who froze during training drills. Nothing remarkable. And yet here he was. Standing under the quiet gaze of alien diplomats who looked like living statues. The Aurelians stood nearly 7 feet tall. Smooth blue skin that reflected the chamber lights like polished stone. Long silver hair flowing down their backs like liquid metal. Their eyes glowed faintly, soft, pale silver, almost luminous. Ethan tried not to stare. One of them stepped forward toward the center platform. The alien ambassador moved with slow, deliberate grace, robes brushing across the floor like drifting mist. The translator drone hovering beside him emitted a soft mechanical hum. A calm synthetic voice filled the chamber. The Aurelian Empire acknowledges the courage of humanity. The assembly went silent. No whispers now. No shuffling papers. Your species fought with persistence beyond calculated probability. For that, you have earned respect. Ethan blinked slowly. That sounded like good news. The drone continued. The Empire therefore offers peace. A permanent alliance between Earth and Aurelian space. Several diplomats leaned forward. Some exchanged hopeful looks. Ethan shifted his weight slightly. Maybe this really was just a ceremony. Maybe they'd shake hands, sign a treaty, and he'd be back at base eating cafeteria eggs by morning. The alien ambassador raised one long blue hand. However, Aurelian law requires a binding union between royal blood and allied species. Ethan frowned slightly. That sounded complicated. The translator voice remained perfectly calm. The imperial princess requires a consort. A ripple of confusion moved through the chamber. Ethan heard someone whisper behind him. The ambassador's silver eyes moved slowly across the hall, until they stopped. On him. The drone spoke again. After genetic and psychological evaluation, a suitable human has been identified. Ethan felt the sudden, unmistakable sensation of every eye in the room turning toward him. The ambassador lifted one long finger. Pointing directly at Sergeant Ethan Walker. This one. Silence dropped into the chamber like gravity had doubled. Ethan blinked once. Then twice. His first thought was simple and immediate. This had to be a joke. The silence inside the United Earth Assembly did not break immediately because no one was certain they had heard the translation correctly, and Sergeant Ethan Walker stood frozen on the polished marble floor wondering if someone had slipped a hidden camera into the room for the most elaborate prank in human diplomatic history, as hundreds of eyes locked onto him while the towering Aurelian ambassador remained perfectly still with one long blue hand extended in his direction, and Ethan slowly turned his head to the left and then to the right, expecting to find another soldier standing behind him, but there was no one else there, only diplomats, military officers and alien observers watching him as if he had suddenly become the most important person on the planet. And Ethan cleared his throat quietly, hoping someone would correct the situation, but the translator drone hummed again and repeated the announcement. In the same calm mechanical voice that carried through the massive chamber like a church bell, the identified human candidate for imperial consort is Sergeant Ethan Walker of the United Earth Defense Forces. And a soft ripple of whispers spread through the assembly seats like wind across tall grass, while Ethan felt the strange sensation of heat climbing up the back of his neck, because a moment earlier he had been a background soldier at a diplomatic ceremony and now apparently he was a marriage candidate for an alien princess he had never seen before. And Ethan leaned slightly toward the colonel standing 3 feet away from him and whispered under his breath, "Sir, please tell me that is a translation error." But the colonel did not smile, he did not laugh, he simply stared forward with the same rigid posture as if the entire room had suddenly become a military briefing, and after a few seconds he murmured quietly without looking at Ethan, "Sergeant Walker, stand straight and do not say anything else until instructed," which was the exact kind of response that made Ethan's stomach tighten, because colonels did not give that tone of voice during jokes. And across the chamber the Aurelian ambassador slowly lowered his hand and turned toward the gathered representatives of Earth while the translator continued. The Imperial Genetic Council conducted compatibility analysis across multiple human candidates, and Sergeant Ethan Walker demonstrates the highest biological compatibility with the royal lineage of the Aurelian Empire. And somewhere in the upper balcony a journalist dropped a tablet device that clattered loudly against the railing before anyone quickly picked it up again, while Ethan blinked slowly, trying to process the phrase biological compatibility, because that sounded less like diplomacy and more like a medical report, and he suddenly remembered the strange medical exams he had been ordered to complete 2 months earlier at a secure military facility outside Denver. When technicians had taken blood samples, nerve scans and a full psychological evaluation, and when he asked why they needed so many tests, the answer had simply been classified. And now, standing in the middle of the United Earth Assembly with an alien empire watching him, Ethan began to suspect that those tests had not been routine after all. And the ambassador continued speaking with quiet authority while the drone translated every word. "This union will establish a permanent bond between the Aurelian Empire and the human species, ensuring stability, cooperation and mutual development across our territories." And Ethan could feel the weight of that sentence pressing down on his shoulders, because the room no longer felt like a ceremony, it felt like history moving around him like heavy machinery. And then the ambassador turned his silver eyes directly toward Ethan again, studying him for several long seconds before speaking one final sentence through the translator drone. "Sergeant Ethan Walker, the Empire invites you to join the Aurelian flagship immediately so that the Imperial Princess may meet the human chosen to stand beside her throne." And that was the moment Ethan finally realized that nobody in the room was laughing. The transport shuttle that carried Sergeant Ethan Walker toward the Aurelian flagship was quieter than any aircraft he had ever flown in, and that silence felt heavier than the weight of the entire situation pressing on his mind, as the small viewing window beside his seat revealed the enormous silver hull growing larger with every passing second until the alien vessel filled nearly the entire sky like a floating continent made of polished metal and soft white light, while the shuttle pilot sat motionless in the front compartment, allowing the automated docking system to guide them forward. And Ethan found himself gripping the armrest as if that small gesture might somehow help him remain grounded in reality, because only 3 hours earlier he had been standing inside the United Earth Assembly believing someone would eventually laugh and explain the misunderstanding, but instead military officials had escorted him through secure corridors, handed him a fresh uniform and quietly informed him that the invitation from the Aurelian Empire was both real and extremely important for the survival of human diplomacy. And now the shuttle drifted closer to a massive opening in the flagship where glowing blue guidance lights stretched across a landing corridor nearly half a mile wide, and Ethan stared through the window as the scale of the alien technology slowly erased any lingering doubt that this entire situation was real, because no human shipyard on Earth could build something even half This size, and as the shuttle crossed the threshold into the docking bay, the light outside changed from the bright reflection of Earth sunlight to the calm silver glow of the ship interior, where towering structures and smooth curved walkways rose hundreds of feet above the landing platform like the inside of a futuristic cathedral, while several Aurelian attendants waited in perfectly still lines near the arrival gate, their tall blue figures illuminated by thin columns of white light that made the polished metal floor shine like glass. And when the shuttle finally settled onto the platform with a soft mechanical sigh, Ethan took one slow breath and reminded himself that he had walked into worse situations during military deployments, though none of those had involved the possibility of becoming the husband of an alien princess. And the hatch opened with a quiet release of air pressure, allowing a cool, unfamiliar scent to drift into the cabin, something faintly mineral mixed with the sterile cleanliness of advanced technology. And a human diplomatic officer standing beside the exit nodded toward Ethan with the careful expression of someone trying not to reveal how unusual the moment truly was while he spoke. In a calm professional voice, "Sergeant Walker, please follow the escorts and remember that you are representing Earth today." And Ethan stepped down from the shuttle onto the vast metallic floor, where his boots echoed softly in the enormous chamber, and the line of Aurelian attendants turned toward him in perfect synchronization, their luminous silver eyes studying him with a quiet curiosity that made him feel both examined and strangely welcomed at the same time. Before one of them stepped forward, slightly taller than the rest, with long silver hair flowing over a formal robe that shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, and the translator device hovering near the attendant produced a smooth measured voice that filled the space between them. "Sergeant Ethan Walker, welcome aboard the imperial flagship of the Aurelian Empire. The imperial princess awaits your arrival." And Ethan slowly looked past the attendants toward the distant corridor, where a pair of enormous doors stood open, revealing a long pathway of glowing white stone leading deeper into the ship. And for the first time since leaving Earth, he realized something important. The moment he stepped through those doors, his life would no longer belong entirely to him. The corridor leading deeper into the Aurelian flagship stretched farther than Ethan expected, nearly a quarter-mile of smooth pale flooring that glowed softly beneath his boots, while thin lines of silver light traced along the walls like quiet rivers of energy. And the air felt cooler than Earth air, clean and dry, with a faint mineral scent that reminded him of standing near mountain stone after fresh rain. And the group of Aurelian attendants walked ahead of him in calm synchronized steps, their long robes drifting gently behind them as if gravity inside the ship had been carefully tuned to make every movement look graceful, while Ethan followed at a measured pace, trying not to stare at everything around him, even though the scale of the place made it nearly impossible not to, because every doorway was tall enough to fit a two-story building, and every curved arch overhead looked like it had been carved from a single piece of glowing metal. And somewhere in the distance he could hear the deep quiet vibration of the ship engines, like a distant heartbeat moving through the structure. And after several minutes of walking, the attendants guided him through a wide circular doorway into a chamber that looked less like a military space and more like a living garden floating in the center of a starship, where a wide pool of clear water stretched across the middle of the room, reflecting soft light from above, and tall pale plants rose from stone beds arranged in gentle curves around the water, their leaves glowing faintly blue as if they carried their own light, while a narrow bridge of smooth white stone crossed the pool, leading toward a raised platform at the far end of the chamber. And the attendant stopped near the entrance and turned toward Ethan with quiet precision before the translator drone spoke again in its calm neutral voice. "Sergeant Ethan Walker, the Imperial Princess will meet you here. Please remain where you are until she arrives." And with that simple statement, the attendant stepped back, leaving Ethan standing alone near the edge of the water, while the enormous chamber settled into a peaceful silence broken only by the quiet ripple of the pool and the soft hum of distant machinery. And Ethan slowly exhaled, realizing this was the first moment since leaving Earth that he had been allowed to stop moving and actually think about what was happening. And he rubbed the back of his neck as he looked across the calm water reflecting the ceiling lights, wondering what kind of conversation a human soldier was supposed to have with the daughter of an alien empire. And he had just begun to consider several very bad opening sentences when a faint sound behind him made him turn his head slightly, and he saw someone stepping onto the far end of the stone bridge, a tall figure moving slowly and with quiet confidence. And even from the distance Ethan could see the same smooth blue skin and long silver hair he had noticed on the other Aurelians, but something about this presence felt different, more focused, more Deliberate like the room itself had shifted to acknowledge her arrival, and as the figure walked across the bridge the light from the pool reflected upward across her features, revealing calm silver eyes studying him with the kind of careful curiosity one might use when examining something entirely unfamiliar. And Ethan straightened instinctively, because even without anyone announcing it he already knew exactly who had just entered the chamber. And when she finally reached the center of the bridge, she stopped and regarded him in silence for several long seconds before the translator device floating nearby activated and her voice emerged through it, clear, steady and unmistakably direct. "So you are the human they selected for me." And Ethan realized that meeting the princess of an alien empire felt surprisingly similar to standing in front of a very serious commanding officer, except this one happened to be about to decide whether he belonged anywhere near her world. Princess Lysra remained standing at the center of the narrow stone bridge while the faint blue light from the garden pool below reflected across her smooth skin like moonlight over calm water, and Sergeant Ethan Walker realized that the quiet moment stretching between them was not accidental but deliberate, because she was studying him carefully the way a scientist might observe an unfamiliar life form. And Ethan shifted his weight slightly, before offering a small respectful nod, the same gesture he would give a senior officer, although he suspected the princess of an alien empire ranked somewhere far above any officer he had ever met. And the translator drone hovering near her shoulder carried her voice across the chamber again, calm and controlled. "You appear smaller than I expected." And Ethan blinked once before answering honestly, because he had long ago learned that honesty was often safer than trying to sound impressive in front of authority figures. "With respect, Your Highness, most humans are about my size." And for a moment her silver eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in evaluation, as if she were measuring the tone of his response rather than the words themselves. While the garden remained perfectly still around them, the glowing plants giving off a soft quiet light that made the entire room feel removed from the rest of the massive warship. And Lysra began walking slowly across the bridge until only about 10 feet separated them, and Ethan could now see the fine details of her appearance, the faint patterns along her skin that looked almost like delicate lines of crystal, and the calm intensity behind her luminous eyes. Before she spoke again through the translator, "You understand that this union was not chosen for emotional reasons," and Ethan let out a quiet breath that carried a hint of dry humor despite the gravity of the moment. "Yes, ma'am, I started to suspect that when an entire alien empire showed up at Earth to ask for my hand in marriage." And for the first time a subtle shift crossed her expression, not quite amusement but something close to curiosity, as if the response had not followed the outcome she predicted. And she studied him for several more seconds before asking another question. "You are a soldier, yet you display little fear standing here." And Ethan shrugged slightly while glancing around the glowing garden, because fear was not exactly the word he would have chosen for the strange mix of disbelief and cautious acceptance he felt. "I have been in a few situations where things stopped making sense, and worrying about it did not help much." And the princess tilted her head slightly, the movement slow and thoughtful, while the translator carried her next words into the quiet air. "Your species resisted the Empire far longer than our strategic models predicted. Most civilizations surrender quickly when faced with superior technology." And Ethan rested his hands lightly at his sides, remembering long training days and quiet conversations with fellow soldiers during long deployments. "Humans are stubborn, Your Highness. Sometimes we keep going just because someone beside us needs help standing up again." And Lysra remained silent after that statement, her silver eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether the answer came from rehearsed diplomacy or genuine belief. And after several long seconds she turned slightly toward the calm pool beside the bridge, watching the glowing water ripple gently before speaking again in a softer tone. "Our records say that during the war you returned to recover injured soldiers even when your mission was already complete." And Ethan frowned slightly, surprised the Empire knew that detail before replying in a simple matter-of-fact voice. "They were my people. Leaving them behind was never really an option." And the princess slowly turned back toward him, studying him again as though something about that explanation had introduced a new variable she had not accounted for. And in that quiet moment inside the glowing alien garden, Ethan realized the conversation was no longer just about diplomacy or genetics, because the princess was no longer looking at him like a political requirement. She was beginning to look at him like a question. Princess Lysra remained beside the glowing pool for several quiet seconds after Ethan finished speaking, and the faint ripples across the water reflected soft patterns of blue light across the smooth stone bridge, while Sergeant Ethan Walker stood where he was, trying not to feel like a specimen inside a laboratory observation chamber, because the way her silver eyes studied him suggested she was carefully re-examining assumptions that had existed long before he stepped onto this ship. And finally, She spoke again through the translator drone, her voice calm but noticeably slower, as if each word was being considered before release. Human records describe loyalty as a moral virtue, yet most advanced civilizations abandoned such behavior long ago because it is inefficient. And Ethan let out a small breath while glancing briefly toward the glowing plants surrounding the pool, because he was not exactly used to defending the philosophy of his entire species during casual conversation with alien royalty, but he answered the best way he knew how. Maybe it is inefficient sometimes, but humans learned early that survival alone is not enough if the people beside you disappear along the way. And Lysra watched him carefully, as if measuring the weight of that idea against centuries of imperial logic, before she began walking slowly along the edge of the bridge, her steps silent against the polished stone, while the translator continued carrying her voice across the quiet garden. Our empire values order, strength, and calculated progress. Emotional attachment between individuals often interferes with rational decision-making, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the statement before responding in a thoughtful tone. That sounds like a very organized way to run a civilization, but back home most people would probably say life without attachment is not much of a life at all. And for the first time since entering the chamber he noticed the faintest shift in the princess' expression, not quite disagreement and not quite agreement either, but something closer to thoughtful uncertainty, as if the concept itself was unfamiliar territory. And she stopped near the edge of the bridge, looking down at the glowing water where a small floating device drifted slowly near the surface, maintaining the delicate balance of the garden ecosystem, before she gestured toward it with one long graceful hand. This vessel maintains the chemical stability of the pool without direct supervision. It performs its task continuously without emotional influence, and it never questions its purpose. And Ethan followed her gaze for a moment, watching the small machine glide quietly across the water before answering in a calm voice, "It is a good machine, but it is still just a machine, Your Highness. People ask questions because they are trying to understand why something matters." And Lysra turned her head slowly toward him again, the silver light of the chamber reflecting in her eyes, while the translator carried her next words in a softer tone, "You believe that meaning requires uncertainty," and Ethan gave a small nod. Most humans would say meaning only exists because uncertainty does, and the garden fell silent again except for the gentle movement of water and the distant hum of the starship systems echoing faintly through the structure. And for several long seconds the princess simply observed him with that same careful curiosity before she spoke again. "The Empire selected you because your genetic profile was compatible with our royal lineage, but I am beginning to suspect that is not the most unusual thing about you, Sergeant Walker." And Ethan raised an eyebrow, slightly unsure how to respond to that observation, until she added quietly through the translator, "You appear to carry ideas that our models did not predict." And standing there inside a glowing alien garden thousands of miles above Earth, Ethan realized that whatever this strange arrangement was supposed to be, it had already become something far more complicated than a political alliance. The quiet of the garden did not last forever, because somewhere beyond the curved walls of the chamber the enormous starship continued its endless motion through orbit. And after several silent moments Princess Lysra turned her gaze away from the glowing pool and looked directly at Sergeant Ethan Walker again, her silver eyes sharper now, as if some internal calculation had reached a conclusion, while the translator drone adjusted its position near her shoulder and her voice carried across the calm air with a tone that was noticeably firmer than before. "Sergeant Walker, there are members of the Imperial Council who strongly opposed the decision to bring a human aboard this vessel," and Ethan folded his arms loosely behind his back, the way soldiers often do when listening to serious briefings, because the shift in her voice sounded very similar to the beginning of a strategic update. And she continued without hesitation, "They believe that humanity represents unpredictability within a system that values control." And Ethan gave a faint half-smile that held no arrogance, only quiet recognition. "I cannot really argue with that description. Humans tend to surprise people, sometimes even ourselves." And the princess studied him for a moment before slowly pacing along the edge of the bridge again, the gentle light of the garden reflecting across the smooth lines of her robe as she spoke. "Their concern is not simply cultural difference. They fear that introducing human influence into imperial leadership may create instability across the empire." And Ethan looked toward the wide chamber around them, the glowing plants, the calm water, the massive alien architecture, and he realized that somewhere beyond these walls an entire civilization was debating whether allowing one human soldier into their royal family might disrupt centuries of carefully structured order. And he answered quietly, "Sounds like they have a point, Your Highness." And that response caused Lysra to stop walking, because she clearly had not expected agreement, and she turned toward him again, her silver eyes narrowing slightly with thoughtful surprise. "You accept their concern without protest," and Ethan shrugged gently. "Back home when people worry about change it usually means they think something important might break. I understand that feeling," and the translator carried her next question with quiet curiosity. "Then why did you agree to come aboard when the invitation was offered, and—" Ethan exhaled slowly, remembering the moment inside the assembly hall when every camera and every government official had been watching him, waiting for a response that could influence the future of Earth, and he answered in a calm voice that echoed softly through the chamber, "Because sometimes the only way to prove people wrong about you is to show up and be yourself." And the garden fell silent again except for the distant hum of the ship systems and the soft ripple of the glowing water, and Lysra remained still for several seconds, absorbing that answer before she spoke once more. "Some within the council intend to observe your behavior closely. They believe that eventually you will reveal the flaws they expect to see," and Ethan nodded once, not offended, not defensive, simply acknowledging the reality of the situation. "Then I guess I will try not to disappoint them too much." And for the briefest moment something very close to amusement passed across the princess' expression before she looked toward the high ceiling of the chamber, where a circular opening revealed a narrow view of the distant stars beyond the ship hull, and when she spoke again her voice carried a thoughtful weight that had not been there before. "Sergeant Walker, you may not realize it yet, but your presence here has already begun to change more things than the council understands." And standing there beneath alien stars reflected through the ceiling, Ethan had the quiet feeling that whatever challenge waited ahead inside this empire, it was no longer only about a diplomatic arrangement, it had become something far larger than a simple political marriage. Princess Lysra stood beneath the circular opening in the ceiling where distant stars shimmered faintly beyond the protective hull of the flagship, and for a long moment neither she nor Sergeant Ethan Walker spoke, because the quiet of the garden had taken on a different weight now, something more thoughtful and more serious, as if the conversation between them had slowly crossed from simple curiosity into a deeper territory neither of them fully understood yet, and Ethan followed her gaze upward toward the narrow window where the black of space stretched endlessly beyond the ship, and he realized that somewhere far below that view the blue curve of Earth was still turning slowly beneath the enormous shadow of the alien vessel. And Lysra finally broke the silence, her voice emerging through the translator drone with a quiet steadiness. "The Imperial Council will convene tomorrow to observe you formally," and Ethan shifted his stance slightly, resting his hands loosely at his sides while the calm glow of the chamber reflected across the polished floor. "Observe me doing what exactly, Your Highness?" And she turned from the starlight to face him again, her expression composed but more open than it had been when they first met on the bridge. "They will speak with you, question you, and evaluate whether the Empire made a mistake allowing a human to enter the royal line," and Ethan gave a slow nod, absorbing the information because it sounded remarkably similar to certain military review boards he had attended during his service, though the scale of this one appeared to involve an entire alien government, and he answered with quiet honesty, "That sounds like a long meeting," and something in the tone of his voice caused the faintest hint of amusement to flicker across Lysra's features before she continued in a thoughtful voice, "Many of them expect you to fail this evaluation," and Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly, not offended but curious. "That is a very encouraging introduction." And she stepped closer along the edge of the pool until only a few feet separated them, the soft light of the glowing plants outlining her silhouette while the water reflected gentle waves across the underside of the bridge. And when she spoke again the translator carried a tone that held both certainty and quiet reflection. "They believe humans are impulsive, emotionally driven, and resistant to authority. They think that eventually your behavior will confirm those expectations," and Ethan considered that description carefully before giving a small shrug. "I cannot promise I will never prove them right. Humans can be a little unpredictable sometimes." And the princess studied him for a moment before asking a question that seemed to carry more weight than the others. "Then why do you appear so calm about facing their judgment?" And Ethan looked once more toward the distant stars visible through the ceiling opening and answered slowly, choosing his words with the same steady honesty he had used since the conversation began, "Because I have already met the person whose opinion matters most in this situation." And Lysra's expression shifted slightly as if she had not expected that answer, and she asked quietly, "You mean the council leader?" And Ethan shook his head gently before meeting her silver gaze again. "No, Your Highness, I meant you." And the garden fell silent once more, the only sound the faint movement of the water and the distant hum of the ship systems echoing through the enormous structure, while Lysra regarded him with a thoughtful stillness that lasted several long seconds before she finally spoke again, her voice softer than before yet carrying a quiet conviction that seemed to surprise even herself. "Sergeant Walker, when the council meets tomorrow I will be there beside you," and Ethan gave a calm nod, accepting the statement without hesitation because something about the way she said it suggested that whatever challenge awaited inside the Imperial chamber it would not be faced alone. The Imperial Council chamber was far larger than Ethan Walker expected, a circular hall carved from polished crystal-like stone where towering columns curved upward into a high vaulted ceiling that glowed faintly with soft silver light, and when the doors opened the quiet inside the chamber carried the weight of an entire civilization watching, and Ethan stepped forward beside Princess Lysra while the translator drone floated carefully near his shoulder because along the curved tiers surrounding the central floor dozens of alien figures already waited, their robes marked with symbols of rank and authority, and every one of them had turned their attention toward the lone human soldier who had somehow become the center of an interstellar decision. And Ethan stood calmly in the middle of the chamber with his posture relaxed but steady, the same way he had stood during military briefings on Earth, except now the audience was not a room of officers but the leadership of an empire that had ruled thousands of star systems for centuries. And after several quiet seconds one of the council elders stepped forward from the elevated ring above the chamber floor, his tall frame wrapped in deep blue ceremonial fabric, and his voice echoed through the chamber amplified by unseen technology. "Sergeant Ethan Walker of Earth, you stand before the Imperial Council to answer a simple question." And the translator drone carried the words clearly beside Ethan's ear while the entire chamber remained silent, enough to hear the faint hum of the station orbiting far above the distant planet below. And the elder continued, "Why should this empire place trust in a human whose species we barely understand?" And Ethan considered the question carefully for a moment, not because he needed time to invent an answer but because he wanted to say something honest in a place where every word clearly mattered. And finally he spoke in the same calm voice he had used since arriving on the ship, "I do not think you should trust me right away." And a quiet ripple moved through the council seats because the response had not been expected, and Ethan continued without hesitation, "Trust is something people build over time. Where I come from we do not give it automatically, we earn it by showing up, doing our jobs and treating each other with respect even when we are different." And the translator repeated his words across the chamber, and the elder studied him for several seconds before asking another question. "And if this empire refuses the arrangement that has brought you here, what then, human soldier?" And Ethan looked briefly toward Princess Lysra standing beside him before returning his attention to the council leader and answering with quiet sincerity, "Then I will go home and tell my people that the empire treated me fairly and listened before making its decision, because sometimes being heard is more important than getting the answer you want." And the chamber became very still after that because the council members had expected pride or defiance or negotiation, yet what they heard instead was something simpler, something strangely familiar. And after a long moment the elder slowly turned his gaze toward Lysra. "Princess, you stand as witness to this human character. Do you support his words?" And Lysra stepped forward gracefully, the silver patterns on her robe catching the chamber light, while her voice carried with calm certainty across the hall. "Yes, I do, because in the time I have spoken with Sergeant Walker he has shown qualities that our empire claims to value: honesty, patience, and respect for life beyond his own species." And the elder considered her statement before slowly raising one hand, signaling the chamber to silence any quiet discussion still forming among the council members. And when he spoke again his voice held a tone that sounded less like judgment and more like recognition. "Then perhaps today we have learned something unexpected about humanity." And as the council chamber remained silent, Ethan Walker simply stood there beneath the enormous alien ceiling, realizing that he had